boy who would one day become Sidney Reilly was born into a world split by war and subterfuge. Born Sigmund Rosenblum in Odessa, Ukraine, at the close of the 19th century, he watched the crumbling empires of the world divide the globe and its spoils, soaking entire continents in blood while sowing the seeds of their own destruction in the process. It was a world brimming with revolution, and for a man like young Sigmund, this meant opportunity. He was very much a product of the Victorian era, which was at its end and rife with global intrigue. Appropriately, there was hardly a moment in his young life that was not spiked with suspense and shrouded in some kind of mystery. From enigmatic origins operating against Imperial Russia in the Ukraine to his equally mysterious death, it is nearly impossible to separate the man from his own myths. But in between, he would shape events that still reverberate today. By some accounts, he would become a literary influence in his own lifetime, culminating in Ian Fleming's timeless anti-hero James Bond little more than a generation after Reilly's own death. And while he was alive, he kept artists, particularly women, as his closest friends and even lovers, including the celebrated Irish novelist Ethel Voynich. Reilly and his associates later indicated that the protagonist of her 1897 novel-turned-film The Gadfly was based on young Rosenblum. But in reality, young Rosenblum most likely lifted his identity from Voynich instead, the beginning of a pattern of personal deception that would remain a recurring theme throughout his life. Voynich and Reilly were almost certainly lovers, and some have even speculated that he informed on her politically subversive husband to Scotland Yard, simply to get him out of the way. Many historians have branded Reilly as more of a con artist and war profiteer than an actual spy. Certainly, one of his greatest accomplishments was achieving fame and several fortunes in a business that places a premium on silence, discretion, and anonymity. From today's war crimes in the Ukraine, modern energy strategies, the pervasiveness of disinformation, election interference, political subterfuge, all these echoes of Reilly's dangerous gambits can still be felt a century after his death. And if even a small fraction of his legend is true, he was an incredibly resourceful individual and an agent without equal in the history of espionage. Even Reilly's birth is shrouded in mystery. The only facts shared by all accounts is that of his birthday, March 24th of 1873, or possibly 1874. Accounts of his lineage range from the son of an Irish clergyman to the heir to a family of aristocratic Polish landowners. In some versions, he's an only child, while in others, he has one or even two sisters. The actual truth was obscured by Reilly so long ago that it's now impossible to determine. His dossier with Soviet intelligence at the time of his death tells yet another story, this time that of the illegitimate son of a doctor or merchant marine captain. In fact, the only things that can be established with any certainty at all are that he was born in or around Odessa in the Ukraine, was of Jewish extraction, and spent his earliest years conspiring fervently against the Russians.
Over the course of his career, he dabbled in many different projects, to put it mildly. I think if there was one cause that he had that sustained him throughout all the years when he was working for the Japanese and going to South Africa and all of his other amazing exploits, it was Russia.
And he would soon take up arms against them in what was already an old conflict over 100 years before Vladimir Putin's own atrocity in the Ukraine. In other words, even in Reilly's day, the struggle for Ukrainian independence was nothing new. Although he exhibited a remarkable aptitude with a broad range of subjects, he did not attend university at Heidelberg or Cambridge, nor did he attend the Royal College of Mines, all of which he is said to have claimed. Whatever his academic origins, it seems clear that young Reilly's lack of foundation had a profound and lasting psychological impact. From incessant womanizing and compulsive gambling to his itinerant, fraudulent, and incredibly reckless lifestyle. He inhabited a world we would find both recognizable and strange, still heaving from the birth pangs of the Industrial Revolution, but also of representative democracy and communism. And as is the case today, his native Ukraine and the rest of the Balkan countries were hotbeds of political intrigue and violence in the face of Russian imperialist aggression. Rosenblum was hungry for fortune and glory amid the unrest and radical change that was just over the horizon, and his first exploits might as well have been pulled from today's headlines as an anti-Russian courier, saboteur, and subversive in and around his native Odessa. Espionage was a different business in those days. With no technology to rely on, it was a highly personal game played mostly by diplomats and military attaches, wherein a single individual's wit, influence, and skill really could make or break an empire. But working as an agent provocateur against Russia anywhere on the European continent was dangerous work even then, and the feared Imperial Intelligence Service, the Okhrana, took an interest in Rosenblum at a very early age. According to Russian secret police files, he was first arrested in the Ukraine in 1892 at the age of 18 for serving as a courier to a local revolutionary group. However, later friendships with known Okhrana agents suggest that he may have been an informer for that agency as well as their target. Regardless, his relationships with the Tsar's intelligence service and its communist successors would both help and haunt him to the end of his career. He served a brief term in prison for his subversive activities, from which he emerged only to learn that his mother had just died. By some accounts, Sigmund was simultaneously informed by his father that he was the illegitimate son of his mother's former doctor. The medical theme is a recurring one throughout his life and may actually contain some slivers of the truth. It would certainly explain the Russians' final assessment of him, as well as his knowledge of chemistry, patent medicine, and his penchant for masquerading as a doctor. Additionally, some intelligence historians have also diagnosed him as a mild epileptic, a condition that would have created a certain level of familiarity with, and perhaps even admiration for, the medical profession early in life. Regardless, Reilly appears to have turned his back on his homeland at this time, including whatever was left of his family, dramatically faked his own death in Odessa harbor, and stowed away from the Ukraine aboard a British ship bound for South America. In Brazil, he adopted the rather unrealistic alias Pedro and worked countless odd jobs, finally claiming to end up as the cook for a British intelligence expedition. It was during this adventure that he reportedly saved not only the expedition, but the life of his first British patron, one Major Charles Fothergill, when hostile natives attacked their encampment. Reilly claimed to have seized a pistol and killed the attackers in a feat of expert marksmanship, for which he was awarded £1,500, a British passport, and passage to England, where he became Sidney Rosenblum. Now, while this Brazilian adventure would remain Reilly's preferred origin story, another account suggests that he arrived in England under very different and far more sinister circumstances after a hasty departure from the residential Paris suburb of Fontainebleau. Evidence suggests that Rosenblum and an accomplice waylaid two Italian anarchists on Christmas Day, 1895, and robbed them of a substantial quantity of revolutionary funds. One of the anarchists had his throat cut and died at the scene, while the other expired from expertly inflicted knife wounds 3 days later. The physical description of one assailant matched Reilly to a T, but by the time they figured this out, he was already crossing the Channel into England. However, sometime later, his accomplice testified to British intelligence regarding Sidney's involvement in the Fontainebleau incident, as well as several other sinister escapades. Not surprisingly, there are still other versions of Rosenblum's mysterious arrival in England, including one in which he established his identity in the time-honored espionage practice of stealing one from a dead person. Perhaps even a dead person of one's own making. By any of these accounts, his entry into England and the beginnings of a new life there were now assured. By early 1896, Reilly had established himself in London, taking up residence in an apartment block on Rosetta Street. He peddled patent medicines to make ends meet, unregulated concoctions whose biggest active ingredients were often opium and/or cocaine. Throughout this period, he also served as a paid informant for an intelligence network run by the Superintendent of Scotland Yard's Special Branch. Even at this early stage, by all accounts, he was a man of considerable personal charm, seductively so to the opposite sex. His string of alleged mistresses over the years ranged from women of letters in the elite of Europe's drawing rooms to a common London prostitute who went by the rather colorful nickname Plugger. In fact, by the time he was offered regular work with British intelligence, he had already left behind successful careers as a con artist, patent drug dealer, and possibly a pimp as well. Historians have also implicated young Rosenblum in a ruble forging scheme, as well as at least one unanswered murder. There is little chance that his new employers were unaware of these extracurricular activities, and it is both a testament to and an indictment of British ingenuity that they were able to set aside their innate sense of propriety and make use of Reilly's stunning, if dangerous, potential. Within a year, the good Reverend was dead, his death certificate signed by a certain Dr. T.W. Andrew. Perhaps not so strangely, Dr. Andrew bore a marked resemblance to young Sidney. And moreover, no physician by that name existed on England's medical rolls at that time. Historians agree that the likelihood that Rosenblum and Dr. Andrew were one and the same is very high. It was at this point that Rosenblum changed his name for the last time, marrying Margaret and taking his new wife's maiden name as his own, just as she inherited the considerable sum of £800,000, making the newly minted Sidney Reilly a very wealthy man. Reilly's identity switch, undertaken with no official application for a name change or British citizenship, was likely facilitated by British intelligence in preparation for his upcoming work abroad. Truth be told, his accented English and Semitic features made for a less than convincing Irishman. Nonetheless, this would remain his favorite cover in the eventful years to come.
So he was around at the time when the British Secret Service was developing what became the gold standard for intelligence services around the world, and later became the model for the CIA, among other services.
Around June of 1899, Reilly traveled to the Russian Empire using a forged British passport and cover allegedly supplied by his contact at Scotland Yard. While in St. Petersburg, Reilly came to the attention of General Akashi Motohiro of the Kempeitai, the Japanese Secret Intelligence Service. A keen judge of character, Motohiro believed that the most reliable spies were those motivated by profit instead of patriotism or sympathy. His assessment certainly proved correct in Reilly's case, and the young British agent soon found himself serving a second master. Reilly, now an agent for both the Japanese and British governments, began to offer financial aid to anyone who would accept it in exchange for information on the Russian military and intelligence services. Reilly also claims to have undertaken reconnaissance work in the Caucasus to sniff out oil, any report of which he would have sold to his contacts in the British government, the Kempeitai, or, knowing Reilly, both. Reilly next appears in Port Arthur, Manchuria. He would remain there for 4 years, reporting on political conditions in the Far East and otherwise influencing espionage activities in the region.
There's a real company called Grinberg and Reilly, and he has a partner named Grinberg, and they sell all kinds of stuff in China. They import American timber, they import Colt pistols.
Still a double agent for the British and Japanese governments, Port Arthur was of particular interest to the intrepid spy. The Russian-controlled port was perpetually under threat of Japanese invasion, and Reilly, true to form, turned the situation to both his personal and professional advantage. By purchasing and reselling enormous amounts of food, raw materials, medicine, and coal, he made an unscrupulous fortune as a war profiteer, all the while reporting on local events to his masters in London and Tokyo. But most significantly, sometime in January of 1904, Reilly and one of his assets, a Chinese engineer, allegedly stole the harbor defense plans for Port Arthur. Guided by these same plans, the Japanese Navy easily navigated Russian minefields and launched a surprise attack on the night of February 8, 1904. The Russian fleet was absolutely decimated and would remain powerless in the Pacific for years to come. For Imperial Japan, Reilly's work helped usher in an era of expansion that would lead to decades of atrocity in Manchuria and finally culminate in the carnage of the Second World War. Reilly was an immediate target of suspicion by Russian authorities. By one account, he discovered too late that one of his business subordinates was in fact a Russian agent. Yet, the resourceful Reilly escaped with his life and fortune intact. This time, it seems, to Tokyo. There has been much speculation as to the identity of this other woman. She appears to be another recurring theme in Reilly's life, and perhaps his greatest secret of all. There's a good deal of evidence to suggest that she may have been a second wife he hid from his friends and employers, not to mention his first wife. By 1906, he's reported to be living in St. Petersburg, where he seems to have renewed his old Okhrana contacts while befriending members of the Revolutionary Underground. There he established himself in a lavish apartment, joined the city's most exclusive social club, and amassed a magnificent private collection of art, specifically Napoleona. All of this has caused speculation that Reilly was spying on local dissidents on behalf of his cronies in the Tsarist Okhrana, which is entirely possible given Reilly's flexible sense of morality. However, it's equally plausible that his high living was funded by recent windfalls from his adventurism in Port Arthur, as well as payments for services rendered to the British and the Japanese. But he didn't remain still for very long. Reilly soon moved on to Paris. Contemporaries describe him at this point as having evolved into a self-confident international adventurer, fluent in several languages, and whose services were highly sought after by many of the world's great powers. But he was also prone to taking unnecessary risks, a trait that would earn him a reputation for recklessness among his peers in British intelligence and elsewhere. But it would also help create a legend. While in Paris, Reilly renewed his acquaintance with his friend and former controller from Scotland Yard, a man named William Melville, who had left Scotland Yard and was now chief of a new foreign intelligence section in the War Office. Melville himself was, by all accounts, a remarkable, if unconventional, law enforcement and intelligence officer.
Melville admitted approaching Russian revolutionaries in London saying that, well, if we go to war with Russia, you guys can become useful to us. So we can give you a lot of money to create problems inside the country. And he's speaking to people who are even representatives of the Bolsheviks.
One story places him in Scotland Yard on one fateful day in 1900, when a young and still unknown Harry Houdini paid them a visit. As the story goes, Melville handcuffed the magician to a pillar as a joke and began to depart for lunch. But as Melville turned his back, Houdini asked if he might join the celebrated detective for lunch. Melville turned to find the little illusionist free, his manacles on the floor. True or not, the episode helped make Houdini a star, but it also demonstrated the hallmark of an intelligence officer far ahead of his time. Melville's willingness to entertain unconventional talent, from Houdini's escapes to Reilly's murderous subterfuge. Sources indicate that shortly after they renewed their acquaintance, Melville employed Reilly's singular talents in what would become the quintessential Reilly adventure, where myth and reality compete to outdo one another. It is known to history as the Darcy Affair.
Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty in Britain, was convinced that the petroleum-fueled navy was the navy of the future. He wanted to transform the British Navy from coal-fueled to oil-fueled, and he thought that whoever has the oil is going to win the next war. But Britain has no oil, and Britain has no colonies that have oil. So here you see the two stories converging. Britain is desperate for oil, and Mr. Darcy has this enormous concession, which looks like it could supply everything Britain ever wanted and more.
Reilly was dispatched to the south of France, where he claimed to have infiltrated a yacht belonging to banking magnate Baron de Rothschild while dressed as a priest. While on board, he claimed to convince Darcy to sell his global oil rights to the British rather than the French, who Rothschild was bankrolling. Most historians have questioned this account, with some attempting to place Reilly all the way back in Manchuria at the time. But others place him squarely in the south of France, in very close proximity to Darcy's hotel and the Rothschild yacht. In all likelihood, Reilly's claim of infiltrating the yacht is a fabrication intended to further his own myth and cover up his actual method. But Darcy did wind up selling to the British, and it appears that Reilly and Melville were both personally involved. The plan was a major coup and succeeded in establishing British domination of the oil trade for decades to come.
Iranian oil fueled the entire British economy, all during the 19-teens and 20s and 30s and 40s. Every truck and bus in Britain was running on oil from Iran. Every factory was running on oil from Iran. The Royal Navy was projecting British power around the world, fueled 100% by oil from Iran. So all of that history was shaped by the fact of British control over Iranian oil. And British control over Iranian oil was, to some extent, maneuvered by Sidney Reilly.
In 1909, at an air show in Germany, Reilly and a fellow SIS agent were said to copy plans for a new German engine from a plane that had crashed during the show, and promptly forwarded them back to MI6 headquarters in London. That same year, Reilly also claimed to have infiltrated the Krupp works in Essen. There he joined the plant fire brigade, which he used as cover to steal the plans for Krupp's latest armaments. He would escape back to England, though not before strangling at least one co-worker who stood in his way. Some accounts indicate two. Unsurprisingly, these two adventures in Germany seem to be at least partly fabricated by Reilly himself.
One of his associates that he later associates with, in New York, a guy by the name of Kurt Orbanowski, did. So if you actually look at this description of the supposed British agent in the Krupp works in Germany, it doesn't match Reilly, but it exactly matches Kurt Orbanowski.
It is true that he was an accomplished pilot. It's also true that he was an agent for U.S. aircraft companies and the German shipyards of Blohm and Voss, among many other munitions makers. But the fabulous tales of his espionage tradecraft during this period cannot be taken at face value, as they have been obviously and shamelessly embellished. By April of 1912, Reilly was back in St. Petersburg in the guise of a wealthy businessman. Reilly founded an aviation club as cover to beguile men and women of influence and report back to MI6 on the state of Russian rearmament. It has also been alleged that he was keeping tabs on one of the most dangerous men in Europe, Sir Basil Zaharoff. A favorite boogeyman of European politicians, Zaharoff was an utterly unscrupulous and incredibly powerful arms dealer known as the Merchant of Death. By the time he died, his villainy had spread so far and wide that he served as the model for both Ian Fleming's Blofeld and Orson Welles' Mr. Arkadin.
Now tell me, if I really had something to hide, What do you think it would be? Whoa, take a guess.
Zaharov was a ruthless businessman who maintained close contacts with many powerful politicians, including British Prime Minister Lloyd George and the Turkish Sultan Abdul Hamid II. Famous for his double and even triple dealing, Zaharov was known to sell weapon systems to one country and then the countermeasures to their rivals. But it was Zaharov's dealings on behalf of armaments giant Vickers that would have drawn Reilly's attention and that of his superiors in the run-up to World War I. Unfortunately, the exact nature of the relationship between Reilly and Zaharov, if any, is difficult to prove. Also, by this time, poor Margaret had turned to alcohol and had attempted to take her own life. However, she missed, shooting out her own eye in the process, and survived to haunt Reilly for the rest of his days. This obviously begs the question, why didn't such a ruthless man just do away with her, as he had likely done away with her first husband in the guise of Dr. Andrew? Most historians agree that she had something on him.
The thing is, wherever he goes, she always knows where he is. I mean, the minute, because he's constantly, I think he's sending her money. That's the simplest conclusion.
Whatever she had on him, it worked. She remained unhappy but alive long after he met his own end. But there was another incident that occurred prior to World War I, one that would have made his life on the continent even riskier than usual. On the evening of October 25th, 1908, a young woman named Louisa Lewis disappeared without a trace from the lobby of the fashionable Cecil Hotel in London's West End. She was last seen talking to a man fitting Reilly's description, and Reilly himself was registered at the Cecil at the time of her disappearance. Most importantly, the last hotel Louisa Lewis worked at was the same place that Margaret's first husband had died, and Louisa had been there that very night. In other words, she was one of the few people who could positively identify Reilly as the mysterious Dr. T.W. Andrew. Now, even if Reilly had no involvement in Miss Lewis's untimely disappearance, it was clear that his past was beginning to catch up with him. He needed a new con and a fresh assignment, and the arrival of World War I gave him just that. For the first years of the war, Reilly lived in the United States, spending most of his time in and around New York City. So much time, in fact, that he's as much a New Yorker as he is a Londoner or even a Ukrainian.
So the U.S. is really this kind of, it's the thing I call the sort of the Manhattan front of the war. Now, the reason why New York is so important is that, well, besides just being the center of the universe, it was the financial capital of the United States. That's where all the big banks are headquarters. That's where the money is. That's where it's the real capital of the country. You know, things go on down in a swamp down in Virginia, but, you know, that's just a formality. The country is run from New York.
Reilly lived and worked in the Big Apple for so many years and is associated with so many addresses, famous, real, falsified, that it makes you wonder why he didn't make the place his permanent home. He maintained private offices at 120 Broadway in the Equitable Building, then after that, nearby on Wall Street in the Cunard Building. He worked for MI6 out of the British Mission at 44 Whitehall Street. For a time, he called the Ritz-Carlton his home, before moving on to the equally luxurious St. Regis Hotel. And a Riverside Drive address is given on his second, or by some accounts, his third bigamous marriage license, this time to the beautiful Russian Nadine Massino. Curiously enough, the only falsified address was the one he provided on his marriage certificate to Nadine. But let's not forget, this was a guy with serious commitment issues.
And in fact, the office that Reilly has at the Equitable Building is the Petrograd Trading Company.
Reilly made a tidy living selling armaments to both the German and Russian armed forces, playing both sides against the middle. It seems that whether he knew Zaharov or not, Reilly had learned a thing or two from the old man's cynical example. Reilly was, without doubt, a peerless spy, dutifully passing any information that came his way back to his British masters, but always for a price. He was also clearly an ice-cold profiteer whose dealings contributed to the ferocity of the war. Much has been made of Reilly's business dealings, from war profiteering to insider trading. And in the end, his ruthlessness only served to cement his untrustworthy reputation in financial circles. But during World War I, at the height of his powers, Reilly was in his element, the consummate networker. And that was ultimately the secret to the multiple fortunes he won and then lost again throughout his lifetime. Magnetic personal charm and a roster of ever more powerful business connections, allies he was only too willing to throw under the bus if the need arose at a later time. It has also been alleged that Reilly was simultaneously engaged in acts of sabotage on the New York waterfront, attributed to the Germans but perpetrated by British intelligence and designed to bring the United States into World War I. It's not that Reilly would have had a problem with this. It's just impossible to prove his involvement. Whether or not that strategy was ever employed, America did eventually enter the war. Combined with the Russian Revolution and the communists' subsequent abandonment of the war itself, Reilly's profiteering was severely curtailed, and he sought a return to paid intelligence work with the British while still in New York. He'd remained in contact with MI6 through William Wiseman, their chief of station in New York, and his deputy, Norman Thwaites. Reilly approached Wiseman, was given a job, and found himself working with a number of fellow operatives out of the British mission in downtown Manhattan. Though their assignment was to coordinate with the U.S. government regarding Imperial Germany and Soviet Russia, their operation also included obtaining trade secrets valuable to British industry and the war effort, a common practice among allies even today.
The Passport Control Office was run by MI6. That was the same all over the world at that time. If you went into the Passport Control Office, if MI6 was there, that's where it operated. And usually the head of station was disguised under the Passport Control Officer, or the Passport Control Officer worked for the head of station.
Wiseman was sufficiently impressed to recommend Reilly's commission as a second lieutenant in the Royal Flying Corps in preparation for further deployment by MI6. This is not as much of a stretch as it sounds, as Reilly was already an accomplished pilot and intimately familiar with the aviation industry. Naturally, not everyone approved of this new development. Reilly's wartime profiteering, adventurism, and womanizing were well known, and many in the intelligence community considered him too unprincipled. But there were also those who realized that his lack of scruples were exactly what would make him such a brilliant agent. Reilly then returned to London, where the one-time contract agent was formally sworn in as an officer in His Majesty's Secret Intelligence Service by its chief, Sir Mansfield Smith Cumming, better known within the tightly knit British intelligence community simply as C. For the first time in his already storied career, Sidney George Reilly was no longer a freelancer or an outsider in class-conscious British society. And while he would never actually be one of them, at least his foot was in the door. A seemingly impossible feat, to be sure, but historians have argued that Reilly's personal charm and flair for intelligence work were such that he would have swiftly ingratiated himself in powerful foreign policy circles, with the likes of Smith Cumming, Lloyd George, and young Winston Churchill. Despite his ruthless adventurism and mercenary nature, probably even because of them, Reilly had earned entry into one of the most elite circles in all of England. But his admission would come with a heavy price, one that he would eventually have to pay in full. His superiors at SIS evidently thought their unpredictable agent made for such an outstanding spy that they were willing to overlook his many flaws when bringing him back into the fold. C himself was on record saying that employing Reilly was a great gamble. Nonetheless, he dispatched his newest agent, now codenamed ST-1, into Russia with the equivalent of 50,000 pounds in diamonds and cash. Much to British outrage, the Russian Revolution of 1917 had put an abrupt halt not only to the reign of Tsar Nicholas, but to Russia's fight against Germany as well. Funded by German Foreign Minister Zimmermann and his multitude of agents, Lenin had secretly entered Russia and ultimately succeeded in overthrowing the Tsar. And Lenin's first official act was to sign a non-aggression pact with Germany, immediately taking Russia out of the war. Aside from Zimmermann's machinations inside Russia, German agents attempted to destabilize governments from Afghanistan to Mexico and the United States to aid the Kaiser's war effort, just as England's legendary T.E. Lawrence was engaged in Arabia on behalf of the Allies. But Reilly was in the unique position of trying to reverse a popular uprising that had already taken hold, rather than causing one outright. Prime Minister Lloyd George considered the communist revolution and withdrawal from the war to be a disaster. He is believed to have dispatched Reilly to report on the situation and convince none other than Lenin himself to re-enter the war. Reilly made his way into Russia via Murmansk at the beginning of April 1918. One account of this journey comes from SIS agent Stephen Alley, who was on his way back to London at the time. While stopped in Murmansk, he was called to a detention facility to verify the identity of a suspicious Irishman claiming to be a traveling diamond merchant. There he found Sidney, who promptly produced a cipher hidden inside a bottle of medicine. Alley recognized this as an SIS code, vouched for Reilly, and secured his release. Now, Reilly had been ordered to travel directly to Petrograd, and the reason he disembarked so early remains a subject of some debate. A visit to his second wife, the secret other woman from Port Arthur, is a possibility. Regardless, he was clearly fortunate to have had a fellow SIS agent on the spot and apparently above suspicion. Stephen Alley himself was something of a renegade and was returning to London under a bit of a cloud. He later alleged that he had refused a direct order to assassinate Joseph Stalin while the future dictator was still just one of Lenin's many deputies. Reilly, meanwhile, with the covert aid of an old friend from the good old days in St. Petersburg, actually acquired Russian Secret Service credentials.
Vladimir Orlov is a fellow who starts out, again, working for the Okhrana, basically. And then in 1918, suddenly shows up in Soviet service. And then again goes to Germany, eventually dies in Brussels under mysterious circumstances around 1940.
With the help of Orlov and a handful of foreign agents, Reilly was about to undertake some of the most audacious missions of his career. One famous story places Reilly at the front gate of the Kremlin, demanding to see Lenin himself. He claimed to have a letter from Lloyd George petitioning the new Russian leader to abandon his treaty and rejoin the war against Germany. According to Reilly's own account, Lenin angrily rebuffed any request to aid England or her capitalist allies and pretty much sent him packing. Whether this was undertaken on Reilly's sole initiative, as part of an actual request by Lord George, or even happened at all, is the subject of debate. There is little doubt, however, regarding Reilly's involvement in the intrigue that followed.
Here was a guy who was involved at the very beginning in the question of what was going to happen to Russia, and he was trying to strangle at birth a movement which went on to cause immense pain for generations to come.
By January of 1918, a young member of the British Foreign Service named Robert Bruce Lockhart arrived in Russia. Handpicked by Lord George to liaise with the new Bolshevik government, his mission was to subvert any future Soviet-German relations through diplomatic efforts. But this initial plan was not to be. Soon, diplomatic talks had broken down or otherwise proven fruitless, and he began to advocate for full-scale military intervention against the Bolsheviks. The situation in Russia had grown so dire for the Russian people that dispatches and photographs reaching the Foreign Office were often unprintable, nearly identical to the atrocities committed by Vladimir Putin in the Ukraine a century later. Innocents were tortured and murdered by the hundreds of thousands, and in the most cruel and sadistic ways imaginable, including systematic blinding, bayoneting, castration, and rape. The executions that took place during Putin's 2022 retreat from Kiev and Bucha, left bound and naked in the streets or in mass graves, would have been familiar sights in Reilly's day. Forever motivated by profit, Reilly nonetheless must have felt at least some genuine empathy for his former countrymen in the Ukraine and elsewhere, as their suffering was renewed under the Bolsheviks. Lockhart's first taste of Reilly allegedly came in the wake of his failed attempt to meet with Lenin. Lockhart had apparently not been informed of Reilly's intent, despite his position as the official representative of His Majesty's government in the New Russia. Lockhart was furious and threatened to send the rogue agent home, but Reilly took a liking to the young diplomat and quickly calmed the man down with his natural wit and charm. Lockhart then ordered Reilly to make contact with sympathetic Russians and other potential conspirators, in particular the SIS agents operating out of the British mission in Petrograd. This group included a veritable who's who and a bit of a rogues gallery of British SIS agents, including Reilly himself, Captain George Hill, the musically inclined diplomat Paul Dukes, Foreign Service Officer Ernest Boyce, Captain Stephen Alley, and one Lieutenant Oswald Rayner. Now, just to give you an idea of what these lads were doing over there, the latter two, our old friend Captain Stephen Alley and Lieutenant Rayner, have recently been identified by historian Andrew Cook as the prime suspects in the assassination of Grigory Rasputin, the religious mystic and advisor to Tsar Nicholas, killed in a futile attempt to save the Russian dynasty from itself. In other words, they were not in Petersburg for the social scene. They were, however, intent on shoring up the empire by manipulating local politics through any means necessary. Reilly's conspiracy was joined by French military attaché Colonel Henri de Vertemont, as well as America's colorfully named agent on the spot, Xenophon Kalamatiano.
Xenophon Kalamatiano was born in Russia. The name is Greek. Kalamatiano knew Reilly in New York. Kalamatiano was a businessman. He was involved in the automobile business.
But Reilly also solicited the aid of some old anti-Bolshevik friends, displaced radicals from Alexander Kerensky's now defunct government who were little better than terrorists themselves. These men and women would have a fateful impact on Reilly's future. Men and women like Boris Savinkov. This wily socialist had several thousand fighters at his disposal and was eager to rid his beloved Russia of the Bolsheviks. By May of 1918, Reilly, Lockhart, and their fellow conspirators met with Savinkov and the final member of their conspiracy, British naval attaché Captain Francis Cromie. Cromie was a Royal Navy officer and a senior figure in British naval intelligence. Though he'd started the war commanding submarine flotillas out of Hong Kong and in the Baltic Sea, he'd been appointed naval attaché to the British Embassy in St. Petersburg. Waiting out the Russian Revolution there, he was highly respected even by the local extremists for his sense of fair play. But the key to all of this was Lenin's personal detachment of Latvian guards who had approached the Allies to betray him, reportedly disillusioned at the direction the revolution had taken. They contacted Cromie directly at the British mission in Petrograd and agreed to join the plot, using as their go-between Cromie's mysterious assistant, a Turkish merchant named Mr. Constantine. In reality, one of Reilly's many cover identities. Mr. Constantine then distributed over 1 million rubles to bribe Lenin's bodyguards as well as members of his inner circle in advance of the planned coup. Their objective was to capture or kill Lenin and Trotsky and establish a government with Reilly, of all people, at its head.
At a given signal, the soldiers were to close the doors and cover all the people in the theater with their rifles, while a select detachment was to secure the persons of Lenin and Trotsky. In case there was any hitch in the proceedings, or the Latvians proved nervous, the other conspirators and myself would carry grenades in our place of concealment behind the curtains.
Lockhart later immortalized his exploits with Reilly in his book Memoirs of a British Agent, and its later and very loose Hollywood adaptation, British Agent, starring Leslie Howard, Kay Francis, and directed by a young Michael Curtiz of future Casablanca fame.
This Englishman, Locke.
Yes?
We have reason to believe that he's supporting the White Revolt.
Then what you need is a scapegoat.
I need sufficient evidence to arrest him. And you must help me to get it. I'll give you the check.
I can't do it, Sergei.
You must. You realize that if he's arrested now, he will only be deported. Later, he will be shot.
In the end, however, Lenin's bodyguards proved loyal and informed on their co-conspirators to Felix Dzerzhinsky, who immediately began unraveling the Lockhart plot. Dzerzhinsky is a legend in the global intelligence community, a man who had earned his position through ruthless, diligent, and brilliant work over a long and storied career. Interestingly, despite his aristocratic Polish origins, he was the most devoted of Russian communists, and Lenin trusted him completely with state security. Dzerzhinsky, for his part, rarely disappointed, and the Lockhart plot was no exception. The remaining plotters would prove no match for his ruthless and methodical counterintelligence work. None of this deterred Reilly, however. Working with fellow agent George Hill, Reilly continued to engage with anyone else who would listen. According to Hill, Reilly at this stage was a dark, well-groomed, very foreign-looking man who had an amazing grasp of the actualities of a situation and was a man of action. And so, despite the failed Lockhart plot, arrests, and countless other setbacks, Allied conspirators continued to hold out hope that a military uprising in Moscow, combined with massive food shortages, could still topple Lenin's government and reopen the Eastern Front against the German Reich. But, as it does, history reared its head and coughed up one of those moments that changes everything. At this point, the plot completely fell apart. To this day, it remains unclear that Kaplan was even responsible for Lenin's shooting. But state security reprisals against the plotters and Lenin's would-be assassins were brutal and swift. Lockhart, Hill, Reilly, and the rest desperately sought to shore up their operations, but there was little they could do. The response to Lenin's shooting was directly modeled on the reign of terror from the French Revolution, and quickly came to be called the Red Terror. Coordinated by Dzerzhinsky himself, the reprisals foiled any chance of success that might have remained. Lockhart and Boyce were arrested, but later returned to the United Kingdom in diplomatic trades. Hill and other Western agents managed to escape, but a very different fate awaited the gallant Captain Cromie. After relaying instructions to Reilly and burning the Petrograd consulate's most compromising documents, Captain Cromie put up a solitary armed resistance on what was technically still British soil. One account has him fending off a large number of Bolsheviks with nothing but a single revolver, while another depicts him firing wildly at his assailants with a pair of Browning pistols. Either way, he apparently took a commissar and several soldiers down before being shot, trampled, and unceremoniously tossed out of a second-story window. Reilly's network of agents, many of them women, were completely rolled up. All would suffer torture and almost certain death at the hands of Russia's intelligence service, the Cheka. But Reilly's own escape was, as usual, a remarkable combination of skilled tradecraft, daring, and dumb luck. Reilly had been advised by fellow British agent and co-conspirator George Hill to leave Russia from the southwest, through his native Ukraine to Baku, making use of a network of agents and safe houses along the way. But for unknown reasons, Reilly chose to avoid his friend's advice entirely. Instead, he followed a quicker, but far more dangerous route north through Petrograd to Finland, and succeeded with the help of the same Checker credentials provided long ago by his old friend Orlov. From Helsinki, he steamed to London with the help of Baltic smugglers, where he arrived completely unscathed on November 8, 1918. But his escape was not without consequences that would blow back on him in the years to come. Tried in absentia by the Soviets later that same month, both Reilly and Lockhart were sentenced to death, a punishment that was to be carried out should either of them ever return to Russia. Though Reilly was a mercenary to the core, and seemingly lacked any real political conviction, he was now more determined than ever to rid his native Ukraine of its brutally oppressive rulership. In a letter to Robert Lockhart, he wrote,
I feel I have no right to go back to the making of dollars until I have discharged my obligations. I also think that the state should not lose my services. I would devote the rest of my wicked life to this kind of work. The salvation of Russia has become a most sacred duty to which we owe the untold thousands who have sacrificed their lives because they trusted in the promise of our support.
It is almost immaterial whether this idealism was genuine or cynical in its nature, simply more leverage to make another buck. It is Reilly's vision of his own purpose and destiny that's on display here, and it was more than a little prophetic. So it was that shortly after their narrow escape, Reilly and Hill were once again dispatched to southern Russia in the guise of British merchants. With Hill acting as courier, Reilly dispatched a string of 12 reports to the Foreign Office, advocating Allied assistance to the anti-Bolshevik cause, even going so far as to suggest establishing a military foothold inside Russian territory.
The military Allied assistance required for this would be comparatively small, as proved by recent events in Odessa. Landing parties in the ports and detachments assisting the volunteer army on lines of communication would probably be sufficient.
But the requested assistance never materialized. Communism cemented its hold on Russia for generations to come, and Reilly once again returned to England to pursue other interests. Chief among them, a pretty young actress named Pepita Bobadilla. He met the vivacious performer at the Hotel Adlon in Berlin in December of 1922. After a brief affair, the two were married in a civil ceremony with George Hill as their witness. Naturally, the marriage was bigamous. Reilly had divorced his Russian wife Nadine, but was still married to his first wife Margaret, despite his best and most ruthless efforts, and there still remains the possibility of a secret third woman. But Margaret was a unique problem. She knew how Sidney had gotten his start. Determined to get her out of the picture, Reilly had engaged in threats of violence as well as bribery to keep her away, even going so far as to plant false stories in the press about her death. And when pressed by his superiors in British intelligence as to how many wives he actually had, he simply lied, telling them that he was unmarried. He was, without doubt, a cold and secretive man, and Pepita certainly knew this firsthand. But through it all, she apparently saw something else. By her own account, he was romantic, a good companion, a man of infinite courage, and the ideal husband. These are her own words, and while ideal husband may be taking things a bit too far, Sidney and Pepita seem to share a genuine bond. Predictably, Reilly was not long for domestic bliss. Within a year of their marriage, he became embroiled in a scandal that rocked the United Kingdom with the likely backing of his superiors at SIS. The Zinoviev letter, from which the ensuing scandal derived its name, was reportedly written by Grigory Zinoviev, head of the Communist International, or Comintern, and it was written to one of that secret organization's British members. Leaked to the press, the letter asserted that resuming diplomatic and trade relations with Russia would bring about the overthrow of the British government. The letter was denounced as a fake by the Russians and the British Labour Party, and Reilly's involvement as its probable courier and possible forger were cited as evidence. Perhaps a more likely candidate, however, was Reilly's old friend Orlov, who had by now evacuated the Soviet Union with a trove of NKVD documents and had set himself up in Berlin as a peddler of both real and forged intelligence.
As Orlov himself, I think, said, maybe even at the trial, he goes, well, the documents may be forgeries. They may be fake, but the information they contain is true.
Regardless of the letter's provenance, Reilly was almost certainly involved in some capacity, even if all he did was act as courier or leak its contents to the press. A Russian-language copy of the letter was later found in Reilly's own handwriting, and he would have had no scruples about using the communique to further his political and financial interests. Despite recent consensus indicating that the letter was, in fact, a forgery, the ensuing uproar in England brought about the fall of Ramsay MacDonald's Labour government and cemented the subsequent Tory administration's position against the Soviet Union, an outcome that would have suited Reilly's interests very nicely. But the Zinoviev letter set a dangerous historical precedent. That a forged letter, full of lies, could, in the modern era, bring down a duly elected government was not lost on future generations of political operatives. By the end of 1924, Reilly was back in New York after falling out with SIS over his continued support for Savinkov, who was, by now, a morphine addict. By day, Reilly looked after his own business interests, and by night raised money for Savinkov's anti-Bolshevik cause. While spending time on Long Island during Prohibition, Reilly is said to have employed an American who cut an even more sinister figure than Reilly himself. Frank Dougherty began serving as Reilly's bodyguard, valet, and driver as early as 1909. And Dougherty was just the tip of the iceberg when it came to Reilly's shady connections in the United States. Some historians have tied him to Arnold Rothstein, the Jewish-American gangster who fixed the 1919 World Series and mentored future mafia kingpins Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky. Rothstein was also the first person to see Prohibition as a business opportunity. Given the Long Island stretch of coastline was a favorite drop zone for valuable shipments of smuggled foreign booze, one can only imagine what Reilly's business dealings out there entailed. It was around this time that SIS agent Desmond Morton was asked by a fellow Foreign Service officer about Reilly's current official status.
Reilly is not a member of our office and does not serve C in that he is not receiving any pay from us. He worked at one time during the war in Russia for C's organization and is now undoubtedly of a certain use to us, but we do not altogether know what to make of him. He is at the moment Boris Savinkov's right-hand man. In fact, some people might almost say that he is Boris Savinkov. As such, he has undoubted importance. Reilly is, of course, a very clever man with means of finding out information all over the world. Whatever his faults, I personally would stake my reputation that he is not anti-British. At the moment, at any rate, and never has been. He is an astute commercial man out for himself and really genuinely hates the Bolsheviks.
Reilly was intent on toppling Russia's government more than ever. It was his old friend Boyce who requested that Reilly make contact with a violently anti-Russian dissident organization known only as the Trust. The Trust had set itself up inside the Soviet Union as a secret government in waiting, a welcome alternative to Stalin's brutish crowd. Within a few years, every nation of the West was throwing money at them in the belief that they were funding Stalin's ultimate overthrow. Boyce suggested that Reilly travel to Finland in order to meet with highly placed Trust operatives.
Much as I am concerned about my own personal affairs, which, as you know, are in a hellish state, I am, at any moment, prepared to chuck everything else and devote myself entirely to the syndicate's interests. I was 51 yesterday, and I want to do something worthwhile while I still can.
Unfortunately, and unbeknownst to the West, the Trust was a front designed to entrap enemies of the Russian state. The whole thing was the brainchild of Felix Dzerzhinsky and amounted to one of the greatest and most expansive counterintelligence operations in history. It even turned a profit for the NKVD. For example, earlier that same year, the Trust had lured Savinkov back to Russia, only to see him captured and imprisoned in the Lubyanka. There he was tortured and soon died in what the Russians described as a fatal accident. Despite this, Reilly agreed to undertake the mission. It's likely that the prospect of vast profits from a relationship with the Trust and its new government may have driven him back into Russia just as much as his loathing of the Bolsheviks. Also of influence was his state of body and mind at the time, as well as the state of his business affairs in the States. All had deteriorated to a precarious point, unhelped by his reputation as an untrustworthy business partner. Reilly was smuggled across the Finnish border by Toivo Vaha, a Finnish-born OGPU officer and future KGB colonel, posing as a member of the Trust. Another senior Russian agent present at his arrest later described Reilly.
The first impression of Reilly is unpleasant. His dark eyes expressed something biting and cruel. His lower lip drooped deeply and was too slick. The neat black hair, the elegant suit, everything in his manner expressed something haughty and indifferent to his surroundings.
Sometime after Reilly crossed the Russian border, Soviet agents finally captured and transported him directly to their headquarters at Moscow's infamous Lubyanka prison. In a disturbing footnote to Reilly's capture, a high-ranking Russian defector later identified Reilly's friend and former SIS station chief Ernest Boyce to the FBI as a double agent and the man personally responsible for betraying Reilly to the Russians. Some historians have pointed very credible fingers at an even more sinister culprit as Reilly's possible betrayer. His old friend, fellow agent, and, most recently, best man at his wedding to Pepita, Captain George Hill. Betrayed or not, once inside the Lubyanka, Reilly's case was taken over by Artur Artusov, a Soviet official who had ordered the execution of Boris Savinkov just 1 year earlier. Sources vary with regard to Reilly's treatment at Artusov's hands. While he may or may not have been harmed physically, he certainly underwent extensive psychological torture through a series of aborted mock executions. During his captivity, Reilly kept a remarkable diary of tiny handwritten notes on cigarette papers, which he hid in the cracks of his cell wall. It contained a log and apparent analysis of OGPU interrogation techniques which Reilly knew would be of value to SIS upon his escape or trade. One eyewitness, an OGPU officer named Boris Goods, claimed the execution was supervised by a senior OGPU agent, while a third fired the final shot into Reilly's chest. Goods also confirmed that the order to kill Reilly came directly from Stalin himself. This initial and rather terse explanation failed to satisfy even the most casual observer. Reports of Reilly's survival persisted as late as 1932, including evidence his wife Pepita claimed to have in her possession. Speculation also ensued that the ever-unscrupulous Reilly had defected and was serving as an advisor to Russian intelligence. But it seems highly unlikely that Reilly, so ready to risk his life and profits for this new Russia, would have ever submitted to Stalinism. And it is equally unlikely that the famously paranoid Stalin would have kept such a dangerous enemy agent alive, much less on his payroll. Stalin was a paranoid tyrant with no qualms about liquidating his closest friends, associates, and family, much less an enemy agent of Reilly's caliber. And every minute Reilly lived was a further embarrassment to his ham-fisted regime. Rumors persisted for years, and theories abound even today, but forensic examinations have since proven that Reilly was indeed dead. Despite his sinister and mercenary reputation, he was quickly lionized by the international press as the greatest spy in history and the Scarlet Pimpernel of Russia. There is no doubt that Reilly's services were invaluable to his clients, from his humble beginnings in the espionage trade in 1896 until his death nearly 30 years later. He was an utterly unscrupulous adventurer and contract agent, focused as much on profit and personal interest as he was on politics.
He was working for himself, and he sold his services periodically to the British, but I think it was an arrangement that suited them both. They didn't want to have him on their payroll. He was too flamboyant, and he had his own aims.
But his skill at what Rudyard Kipling called the great game between East and West, not to mention his dedication to a free Russia and Ukraine, however self-serving, all resonate to this day. Intelligence historians have described him as Cummings' most remarkable, though not his most reliable agent, and the dominating figure in the mythology of modern British espionage. He wielded more power, authority, and influence than any other spy, and was an expert assassin by poisoning, stabbing, shooting, and throttling.
He was enthusiastic about doing it. He was fearless. He was amazingly creative. And he seemed to relish the trade craft of being a spy.
It is worth noting that while Reilly has been held up as an almost evangelical anti-communist crusader and was slavishly devoted to subverting the Kremlin, his personal politics were still very much left of center. From his support of Boris Savinkov's social revolutionaries to the fact that he had absolutely no intention of returning land to the nobility should he have ousted Lenin. Even his idol and mentor Winston Churchill was a member of the British Liberal Party until just before Reilly's death. Largely forgotten today, these details did not escape notice by his peers and raised more than a few eyebrows throughout the intelligence community and Whitehall. Among his other exploits, Reilly is credited, usually falsely, with a number of truly remarkable and frankly unbelievable intrigues. Reilly became a public legend and achieved several fortunes by plying a trade that relies on discretion and anonymity as its bread and butter. And, unlike most of the unsung professionals in the intelligence business, Sidney George Reilly's personal presence is still felt today. A favorite of writers everywhere, he became one of the preferred villains of Soviet cinema. More importantly, he's been the inspiration for countless heroes and anti-heroes, the most famous among them being James Bond. And to historians and members of his rarefied profession, he remains the world's most iconic agent, the proverbial ace of spies. But perhaps most interesting of all is to see how much and yet how little has changed in the centuries since his death. Although the tradition of the gentleman spy may be long gone, assuming it ever existed in the first place, Reilly's model for the mercenary spy exists to this day. Reilly himself has been whitewashed by the passage of time, the press, a BBC miniseries starring Sam Neill, and vindicated by Russian horrors from Stalin to Putin, not to mention the utter failure of the Soviet system itself.
Coming to Talking Pictures TV soon is the series Reilly, Ace of Spies, based on the true-life adventures of Sidney Reilly, a Russian-born British secret agent whose 25-year spying career came to an abrupt end.
Officially, you don't exist. Exactly what Cummings has been looking for years.
But what about the two great players of Rudyard Kipling's Great Game, Britain and Russia? The British would painfully divest themselves of an empire that had once covered a full quarter of all the land on Earth. At times graceful, at others sloppy and violent, she would nonetheless re-emerge as the Commonwealth we know today, one of the great global powers and wealthier than ever. Russia hasn't fared nearly as well. Instead of a managed retreat from a decrepit system like their British adversaries, Soviet Russia simply crumbled beneath its own weight and decay. Former satellite nations spun off to join the European Union and NATO, while the Russian state licked its wounds and devolved first into a corrupt democracy, and then the atrocious kleptocracy of Vladimir Putin's rogue state. Reilly's hometown of Odessa and the rest of the Ukraine still chafe under Russia's relentless attempts at subjugation. Ukrainian independence has come a long way since young Sigmund's days as an agent provocateur, and its people more fiercely defiant than ever. Of course, we can't ignore Sidney's dark side. We can't ignore the legacy of dirty politics, disinformation, and profiteering, whose viability in the modern era were first proven by operations like the Zinoviev letter and the Darcy affair. For better and for worse, they are among the cornerstones of modern political action. Today, Reilly's would be an impossible life. Living under the endless glare of social media and the modern surveillance state, it's difficult to even imagine how one could live such a brazenly double life. Reilly's endless process of reinvention brought to life a sinister, if brilliant, creation. By today's standards, when the bulk of espionage activities are carried out by electronic means, Reilly remains the ultimate intelligence agent, the man of action, the embodiment of individual daring and solo initiative. And yet, so much of his life was built on outright lie.
He would cannibalize. This is the he would cannibalize bits and pieces of other people's lives, incorporate their experiences as his own, and then kind of lay these false trails for himself.
Even his final rank of captain was his own invention. When the British government refused his request for a promotion from his original rank of lieutenant, Reilly just started calling himself captain anyway. And to this day, history remembers him as Captain Sidney Reilly, MC. He is at best an anti-hero, at worst a sociopath, a murderous con man, and the embodiment of our darkest impulses. On the surface, Reilly is very much the proto-Bond that author Ian Fleming used as his role model. But Reilly is equal parts Joseph Conrad's character Adolf Verloc, the tragic triple agent of Conrad's 1907 classic, The Secret Agent. Conrad's is an unflattering portrait, to say the least, and it is a novel with which Reilly himself would have been familiar. Set in London's emigre community in the late 1890s, the parallels to Reilly's own experience could not possibly have been lost on him. His transitory, solitary, and fraudulent existence is also a cautionary tale of epic proportions. His personal relationships and finances suffered repeated ruin because of his dedication to the anti-Russian cause and his own self-destructive impulses. And unlike steadier hands, such as Lockhart and Hill, in the end, Reilly paid with his life. But even with the myths dispelled, and at least some of the truth laid bare, Reilly remains a fascinating enigma. Regardless of the price he eventually paid, few agents in the history of espionage flew so high or for so long before such a spectacular fall. And none more so than Sigmund Rosenblum, the emigre Ukrainian Jew who spied from more countries than most people visit in a lifetime, and died with one of England's highest honors, the Military Cross, after his famously assumed name.